One morning, as Gregor Samsa was waking up from anxious dreams, he discovered that in bed he had been changed into a monstrous, verminous bug. He lay on his armor-hard back and saw, as he lifted his head up a little, his brown, arched abdomen divided up into rigid, bow-like sections. From this height, the blanket, just about ready to slide off completely, could hardly stay in place. His numerous legs, pitifully thin in comparison to the rest of his circumference, flickered helplessly before his eyes. "What's happened to me?" he thought. It was no dream. His room, a proper room for a human being, only somewhat too small, lay quietly between the four well-known walls. Above the table, on which an unpacked collection of sample cloth goods was spread out, Samsa was a traveling salesman, hung the picture which he had cut out of an illustrated magazine a little while ago and set in a pretty gilt frame. It was a picture of a woman with a fur hat and a fur boa. She sat erect there, lifting up in the direction of the viewer a solid fur muff into which her entire forearm disappeared. Gregor's glance then turned to the window. The dreary weather, the raindrops were falling audibly down on the metal window ledge, made him quite melancholy. "Why don't I keep sleeping for a little while longer and forget all this foolishness?" he thought. But this was entirely impractical, for he was used to sleeping on his right side, and in his present state he couldn't get himself into this position. No matter how hard he threw himself onto his right side, he always rolled again onto his back. He must have tried it 100 times, closing his eyes so that he would not have to see the wriggling legs, and gave up only when he began to feel a light, dull pain in his side, which he had never felt before. "Oh, God," he thought, "what a demanding job I've chosen. Day in, day out on the road. The stresses of trade are much greater than the work going on at head office, and in addition to that, I have to deal with the problems of traveling, the worries about train connections, regular bad food, temporary and constantly changing human relationships, which never come from the heart. To hell with it all." He felt a slight itching on the top of his abdomen. He slowly pushed himself on his back closer to the bedpost so that he could lift his head more easily, found the itchy part, which was entirely covered with small white spots. He did not know what to make of them, and wanted to feel the place with the leg. But he retracted it immediately, for the contact felt like a cold shower all over him. He slid back again into his earlier position. "This getting up early," he thought, "makes a man quite idiotic. A man must have his sleep. Other traveling salesmen live like harem women. For instance, when I come back to the inn during the course of the morning to write up necessary orders, these gentlemen are just sitting down to breakfast. If I were to try that with my boss, I'd be thrown out on the spot. Still, who knows whether that mightn't be really good for me. If I hadn't held back for my parents' sake, I would have quit ages ago. I would have gone to the boss and told him just what I think from the bottom of my heart. He would have fallen right off his desk. How weird is it to sit up at the desk and talk down to the employee from way up there? The boss has trouble hearing, so the employee has to step up quite close to him. Anyway, I haven't completely given up hope yet. Once I've got together the money to pay off the parents' debt to him, that should take another 5 or 6 years. I'll do it for sure. Then I'll make the big break. In any case, right now I have to get up. My train leaves at 5 o'clock. And he looked over at the alarm clock ticking away by the chest of drawers. Good God, he thought. It was 6:30, and the hands were going quietly on. It was past the half hour, already nearly 1:45. Could the alarm have failed to ring? One saw from the bed that it was properly set for 4 o'clock. Certainly it had rung. Yes, but was it possible to sleep through this noise that made the furniture shake? Now, it's true he'd not slept quietly, but evidently he'd slept all the more deeply. Still, what should he do now? The next train left at 7 o'clock. To catch that one, he would have to go in a mad rush. The sample collection wasn't packed up yet, and he really didn't feel particularly fresh and active. And even if he caught the train, there was no avoiding a blow-up with the boss. Because the firm's errand boy would have waited for the 5 o'clock train and reported the news of his absence long ago. He was the boss's minion, without backbone or intelligence. Well then, what if he reported in sick? But that would be extremely embarrassing and suspicious, because during his 5-year service, Gregor hadn't been sick even once. The boss would certainly come with the doctor from the health insurance company, and would reproach his parents for their lazy son, and cut short all objections with the insurance doctor's comments. For him, everyone was completely healthy, but really lazy about work. And, besides, would the doctor in this case be totally wrong? Apart from a really excessive drowsiness after the long sleep, Gregor, in fact, felt quite well, and even had a really strong appetite. As he was thinking all this over in the greatest haste, without being able to make the decision to get out of bed, the alarm clock was indicating exactly 7:15. There was a cautious knock on the door by the head of the bed. "Gregor," a voice called. It was his mother. "It's 7:15. Don't you want to be on your way?" The soft voice. Gregor was startled when he heard his voice answering. It was clearly and unmistakably his earlier voice, but in it was intermingled, as if from below, an irrepressibly painful squeaking which left the words positively distinct only in the first moment, and distorted them in the reverberation, so that one didn't know if one had heard correctly. Gregor wanted to answer in detail and explain everything, but in these circumstances he confined himself to saying, "Yes, thank you, Mother. I'm getting up right away." Because of the wooden door, the change in Gregor's voice was not really noticeable outside, so his mother calmed down with this explanation and shuffled off. However, as a result of the short conversation, the other family members became aware of the fact that Gregor was unexpectedly still at home, and already his father was knocking on one side door, weakly, but with his fist. "Gregor! Gregor!" he called out. "What's going on?" And after a short while he urged him on again in a deeper voice. "Gregor! Gregor!" At the other side of the door, however, his sister knocked lightly. "Gregor, are you all right? Do you need anything?" Gregor directed answers in both directions. "I'll be ready right away." He made an effort with the most careful articulation and, by inserting long pauses between the individual words, to remove everything remarkable from his voice. His father turned back to his breakfast. However, the sister whispered, "Gregor, open the door, I beg you." Gregor had no intention of opening the door, but congratulated himself on his precaution, acquired from traveling, of locking all doors during the night, even at home. First he wanted to stand up quietly and undisturbed, get dressed, above all have breakfast, and only then consider further action, for he noticed this clearly. By thinking things over in bed he would not reach a reasonable conclusion. He remembered that he had already often felt a light pain or other in bed, perhaps the result of an awkward lying position which later turned out to be purely imaginary when he stood up, and he was eager to see how his present fantasies would gradually dissipate. That the change in his voice was nothing other than onset of a real chill, an occupational illness of commercial travelers, of that he had not the slightest doubt. It was very easy to throw aside the blanket. He needed only to push himself up a little, and it fell by itself. But to continue was difficult, particularly because he was so unusually wide. He needed arms and hands to push himself upright. Instead of these, however, he had only many small limbs which were incessantly moving with very different motions, and which, in addition, he was unable to control. If you want to bend one of them, then it was the first to extend itself, and if he finally succeeded doing with this the limb what he wanted, in the meantime all the others, as if left free, moved around in excessively painful agitation. "But I must not stay in bed uselessly," said Gregor to himself. At first, he wanted to get off the bed with the lower part of his body. But this lower part, which he incidentally had not yet looked at, and which he had also couldn't picture clearly, proved itself too difficult to move. The attempt went so slowly. When, having become almost frantic, he finally hurled himself forward with all his force, and without thinking he chose his direction incorrectly, and he hit the lower bedpost hard. The violent pain he felt revealed to him that the lower part of his body was, at the moment, probably the most sensitive. Thus, he tried to get his upper body out of the bed first, and turned his head carefully toward the edge of the bed. He managed to do this easily, and, in spite of its width and weight, his body mass at last slowly followed the turning of his head. But, as he finally raised his head outside the bed in the open air, he became anxious about moving forward any further in this manner, for, if he allowed himself eventually to fall by this process, it would take a miracle to prevent his head from getting injured. And at all costs, he must not lose consciousness right now. He preferred to remain in bed. However, after a similar effort, he lay there again, sighing as before, and once again saw his limbs fighting one another, if anything, worse than before, and didn't see any chance of imposing quiet and order on this arbitrary movement. He told himself again that he couldn't possibly remain in bed, and that it might be the most reasonable thing to sacrifice everything if there was even the slightest hope of getting himself out of the bed in the process. At the moment, however, he didn't forget to remind himself from time to time of the fact that calm, indeed the calmest reflection, might be better than the most confused decisions. At such moments, he directed his gaze as precisely as he could toward the window, but, unfortunately, there was little confident cheer to be had from a glance at the morning mist, which concealed even the other side of the narrow street. "It's already 7 o'clock, he told himself at the latest striking of the alarm clock. Already 7 o'clock, and still such a fog. And for a little while longer he lay quietly with weak breathing, as if perhaps waiting for normal and natural conditions to emerge out of the complete stillness. But then he said to himself, "Before it strikes 7:15, whatever happens, I must be completely out of bed. Besides, by then someone from the office will arrive to inquire about me, because the office will open before 7 o'clock. And he made an effort then to rock his entire body length out of the bed with a uniform motion. If he let himself fall out of the bed in this way, his head, which in the course of the fall he intended to lift up sharply, would probably remain uninjured. His back seemed to be hard. Nothing would really happen to that as a result of the fall. His greatest reservation was a worry about the loud noise which the fall must create, and which would presumably arouse, if not fright, then at least concern on the other side of all the doors. However, it had to be tried. As Gregor was in the process of lifting himself half out of bed, the new method was more of a game than an effort. He needed only to rock with a constant rhythm. It struck him how easy all this would be if someone were to come to his aid. 2 strong people, he thought of his father and the servant girl, would have been quite sufficient. They would have only had to push their arms under his arched back to get him out of the bed, to bend down with their load, and then merely to exercise patience and care that he completed the flip onto the floor, where his diminutive legs would then, he hoped, acquire a purpose. Now, quite apart from the fact that the doors were locked, should he really call out for help? In spite of all his distress, he was unable to suppress a smile at this idea.